pleasure to have Steve.
All right. Well, I can't help but start by saying, that I'm not the only member of the running family in the room. Would my niece like to wave her hand? This is my Rory running, and she's with AmeriCorps out at Belgrade High School now. Did I say it right? Yep. All right. And so I don't think she's ever heard me give a talk before, so the pressure's really on. Okay, yeah, we better get to work here. This is kind of a high-risk seminar, because probably 3/4 of what I'm going to talk about I don't really know much of anything about. And so if I was smart, I'd stay carefully to the things that I've worked on in the past. But in effect, I'm going to talk you through what that paper in Science 2 weeks ago was about and how I came to the logic of that paper on planetary boundaries. And so, that not going. Where's the forward? The left one. Oh yeah. Uh-oh, now I have to go backwards though. Oh no. Yeah. Sometimes the wheel does it. Oh, come on. No, I'm going forward. Old-fashioned way to previous. That's right, we have to start with this one because this is the start. How many in this room remember the book, The Limits to Growth? Yeah, you can. This is a real age tester for sure. You can see it was published in 1972. When I was an undergraduate at Oregon State, I paid $275 for it. This was the first Earth system model, the very first Earth system model of any kind. And the title says it all. It was a book that, with the most primitive, I mean, by today's standards, trivial model, attempted to evaluate resource limits in human consumption, acceleration of consumption, and try to evaluate when we might hit the limits of the planet. And basically, and before I leave that, and this topic after this seminal book has been revisited a number of times, and some of the most prominent papers are two of Peter Vituzik's, Human Domination of Earth's Ecosystems in Science in '97, Human Appropriation of the Products of Photosynthesis in, I think that one was '86, in Bioscience. The theme of all of these was, can we figure out what the capacity of the planet is for human consumption? And if we can figure it out, are we getting close to the edge? Well, the limits to growth, what's interesting, you go back and see the limits to growth predicted with some, okay, now I have to use the analog pointer. Notice, well, I put it exactly at 2012. This model projected that we might be hitting global resource limits by right about now, the early part of the 21st century. And so, of course, the Limits to Growth book was forgotten about for decades. And as you see, most of the younger generations never even heard of it. But a guy reanalyzed it, an Australian guy, in 2008, with 40 years of real observations of what has happened to global resources, global population, global consumption. And his conclusion was, gee, they look like they were pretty well on target. And so this, when I read the paper in 2008, I started thinking about this. Since I measure global plant production for a living, I started thinking about, I wonder if this question of whether we're reaching some sort of limits to growth is something that is, again, attackable. And one of the things that I guess as an aside before I go any farther on this, it occurs to me how few people ever have the task or the privilege of thinking about the world over the next 50 years. I mean, most of us in our jobs think about maybe our city for the next year or two, or our state for maybe the next decade. In a way, it's a very peculiar privilege and maybe responsibility to be thinking about what's going to be the state of the planet a half a century and a century from now. And with my IPCC authorship in 2007, of course, we spent 3 years thinking about this. So I'd already gotten my mind into this sort of focus of where's the world going over the next half century. And so when this came out, I started thinking, geez, maybe this is something that I want to revisit. Now, there's been some other efforts to, this was an earlier paper by some guys at NASA Goddard, to figure out how much of the planet are humans appropriating. By appropriating, we mean the food we eat, all the wood fiber we use, the land we use for grazing, anything that's being used ultimately for human purposing. So it's a very all-encompassing term. It's not just agriculture by any means. But they came up with, this is about in 2004, suggesting some, well, you can imagine, the populated parts of the world, we were already basically consuming the entire landscape. And when you think about it, when you fly to Washington, D.C., which probably all of us get stuck doing once in a while, next time you do it, look out the window the entire way and see how much of the landscape below you is not completely dominated by human intervention. It's almost every single acre after you cross the Bob Marshall Wilderness area. Boy, the whole rest of the way is already human dominated. So that's the sort of thing we're thinking of here, is how much of this planet are we consuming? Now, a backdrop for this obviously is continued population growth. And it is kind of ironic and useful for me that this is the year I was born. So this graph started the year I was born, and I realized that the population of the Earth has almost tripled in my lifetime alone. And we expect at best to coast to 9 billion in the next half century. That's the current projections, is we have about 2 billion more people to add to the planet in the next half century. And so it's hard to not ask the question, are we consuming and over-consuming the natural capital at a planetary scale? And we certainly have to ask both the scientific and at some point the moral question. Are we now living beyond the long-term carrying capacity of the planet? Now, asking this at a local scale is a pretty direct thing. We can go to a particular farm field or plot and analyze whether we're managing a piece of land in a sustainable way. But to do this for the whole world starts to get pretty interesting. And so I translate that question to something more direct to the sort of things I do. And so I come up with it more this way. Is our current consumption of biospheric, terrestrial NPP, I'll leave the oceans to somebody else, is it sustainable? So that's really my working question for the hour here, is can we figure out if we are consuming biospheric NPP at a sustainable level? And so a one-slide picture of my whole career. My first 15 years in science was done at a plot scale. This was doing my master's thesis in Oregon, measuring water stress on little Christmas trees. But what I've done over the course of my career, as I think Andy touched on, is worked up to things like flux towers to regional analyses with satellites, and then finally to the global scale. So I know plant physiology at a leaf level, and I think that's been very valuable to me when trying to think about global science, that I actually know the original plant physiology. But the scaling logic that goes in between can be sometimes pretty, let's just say abstract is probably the politest word I can say. And so just to give you a one-slide example of how I hypersimplify the biosphere so I can analyze it with the sort of principles that I worked at in my earlier years, I like to think of the whole biosphere, any place on the planet that I can go and evaluate whether that ecosystem is predominantly water limited, temperature limited, or incident radiation limited. And if anybody remembers photosynthesis from their sophomore level plant phys class, doesn't that sound pretty familiar? And so that's really what I did, was abstract some of the simple principles of what drives photosynthesis and respiration and put it into these global algorithms so I can go anywhere in the world and I can get some sense of what's controlling that ecosystem. And that really is the foundation of how we calculate global NPP. You notice we don't pay much attention to species. We have no idea what the 500,000 different species are comprising this. If I tried, then I would still be back at a hectare plot level. And so this is a very abstract view of the biosphere, but very functional. And so we run this algorithm with the NASA satellite, 110 million sample points per day that are calculated, and we calculate that every day for the year, added it up with this basic carbon balance logic, and come up with primary production for each square kilometer of the Earth every year. Now we've been doing this, we're finishing our 13th year. Now we've validated this against flux towers and a lot of other things like that, but that's not what I want to talk about today. I want to just give you the simplest summary that we calculate global plant production from basic principles every year. And then I want to get on to something different. And this is what's different. Having done this calculation of global NPP, we used our algorithm and worked with an earlier satellite. And so we had a paper in Science in 2003 where from this first 20-year set of records, it showed a slight increase in global NPP. And we were quite interested in that, and Science was interested in it, and so that was all great. Well, in 2010, with our new satellite, we did another calculation, and darn if it wasn't going down a little bit. And so we sent it in and said, gee, it looks like global drought is decreasing NPP. And darned if the very next year we had the highest NPP we've ever calculated and completely blew up that earlier trend. But something got me when I put these two together, got me thinking, well, what maybe is more interesting here is how little variability there is. We're looking at 30 years of global NPP, and the variance from year to year is plus or minus only about 2%. 2%. So I thought, does that make any sense that we would have a biosphere that's virtually a steady state biosphere within our measurement precision for sure? And so I tried to think it through in I guess the most direct way I could think of, first looking at changes in overall global vegetated cover, which as best we can measure really hasn't changed much at all. And then at the basic inputs, solar radiation. Solar radiation is virtually constant coming to the Earth. It varies by a quarter of a watt per meter squared out of 1,300 watts. You know, what is that? 0.01% variance in our basic energy input to our system. So that certainly wasn't a source of any variation. Then I thought about precipitation as our basic delivery of water to the terrestrial biosphere. And what I found was, to our best understanding, the global total precipitation only seems to vary by a few percent also. Now, this is a very scale-dependent conclusion. You could have a huge drought in one place and a total flood somewhere else. What this suggests is you add it all together and it seems to add up to about the same amount every year. Now, I'm still waiting for some global precip person to come up to me after and say, man, you're out to lunch on that one, but it hasn't happened yet. And so my working assumption right now is our raw inputs to our biospheric carbon budget of incident radiation and delivered precipitation might be pretty close to constant, which would then make my thought that global NPP is close to constant also. Now, the minute you start thinking that NPP might be constant, and then start imagining human use of biospheric resources into the future, you now have a zero-sum game. You have a pizza that isn't getting any bigger, and as you have more mouths to feed, you're going to be cutting the pizza pieces into smaller and smaller pieces, right? And so this philosophically is a huge step to suggest that, gee, maybe global NPP is a fixed amount that we can't really change. And so I wanted to look farther at whether there's any logic, particularly, no, I'm not even going to try to go back. It's way too complicated for me to follow when I'm trying to. No, I just wanted to make the previous point before I left it, that I decided to look at global agricultural production as a place where I could get some pretty complete global measures to see whether there is any logic of expanding NPP in the agricultural sector. Because here I was hypothesizing that NPP at this theoretical level was fixed, and I basically wanted to test whether that held up to scrutiny with global agricultural numbers. So I went off looking for various pieces of evidence. First, the way the Green Revolution expanded agricultural production over the last 40, 50 years quite successfully has been either adding additional farmland, basically plowing up open raw land and putting it into farm production, or irrigation and fertilizing. So I wanted to look at what evidence I could find of enhanced NPP from those sources. Well, it's pretty interesting that when you start looking at global agricultural land data, it appears to have peaked 20 years ago. There doesn't seem to be any evidence, and this is the best graph, but I had 3 or 4 sources, that the amount of global farmland in production is not going up and hasn't been going up for years and years.
That's acres and percent.
Yeah, this is overall farmland. If you look at the irrigated farmland, and so this is expressed as irrigated land per person. So this is tracking the development of irrigated land relative to the population. Here again, for at least the last 20 to 30 years, it hasn't gone up at all, and maybe it's gone down. And so I found no evidence of enhanced NPP from increased land area over the last number of decades, or of irrigated area.
Why switch to a...
Well, because this is the graph I found. Do you think I sat and did this all myself? I mean, Google Scholar is just magical. Once you have a question, then off you go. And so this is the way they put that slide together, is a per person. Most of this is not per capita, and I'll try to point out to that as I go. It's pretty interesting to see, and this is from a paper in Global chemical cycling, that as important as irrigated agriculture is in certain regions, on a global scale, it doesn't add up to that big a fraction of global crop production. It's only about 6% of total agriculture comes from irrigated land. What's more significant when we think about whether enhanced irrigation can enhance global primary production is that there is evidence all over the world that the freshwater use we have now is not sustainable. One of the classics is in India, and some of you may have heard of this GRACE satellite that measures groundwater. Now, tell me about magic, a satellite that measures groundwater. I can't even keep a straight face when I say that. And I work with these folks, and I can't even understand how it actually works. This thing is magic, but they get papers in Nature and Science so fast that somebody must believe it. Well, they have tracked that in India, there you go, depletion rate of 4 centimeters per year in the groundwater of this entire region, as just an example of unsustainable irrigation of cropland. There's, I'm sure, unsustainable irrigation going on in the U.S. We all know that the Colorado River doesn't even get to the ocean anymore. Neither does the Rio Grande. It's pretty easy to illustrate that, particularly in the western U.S., we don't have any excess capacity for irrigated farmland, except for a little corner up in the Columbia River. And even that, well, the Columbia River does get to the ocean, so in some people's eyes, that means there's extra water. So yeah. The axes on this graph, groundwater withdrawal cubic kilometers per year. And you see India is particularly extreme in using this groundwater-driven irrigation. And so I have a number of my friends that work in global scale water resource issues, and I could give you a whole seminar on just global water supply issues. And they just show over and over and over again that we probably cannot even sustain the amount of irrigated agriculture we have now, let alone think that we're going to enhance it enough to feed 2 billion more people. There's no way you can slice and dice available irrigation water and come up with feeding 2 billion more people. We probably can't sustain what irrigation we have. Now, so then you turn to the potential for increased fertilizer use and enhanced production with fertilizer use. And certainly the Green Revolution has been spectacular in the past in getting us to where we are now. So this is in no way an argument against what was done in the past. I'm trying to figure out what our future capacity is. What I see when I look at the global nitrogen cycle is abundant evidence of, if anything, a global nitrogen cycle that's overloaded in some huge places. We get about a deposition rate of about 1 kilogram per hectare per year, right here in Bozeman. Over here it's 50. In the East Coast it's 50. And in China and India they won't even tell us. So 50 times the background loading of nitrogen into our ecosystems is occurring in the highly mechanized agriculture worldwide. Not so much at all, of course, in the southern hemisphere, but in the northern hemisphere, we're probably already overloading our fertilizer use. There are suggestions that when you look at phosphorus, which we can make all the nitrogen we want if we're willing to use the energy to do it. With phosphorus, you have a finite supply that's mined from rock, guano, and manure, and some of the global biogeochemists see the potential for there being a peak phosphorus, kind of like peak oil, where we could get to the point where there really would be a declining supply of phosphorus. So I put these two things together with nitrogen and phosphorus and come to the conclusion that if anything, we need to use less fertilizer, not more. And when you look at the dead zones that we're starting to get in the oceans at the mouths of some of our major rivers, and this is specifically caused by nutrient runoff in those rivers, triggering phytoplankton blooms that then die and consume the oxygen in these oceans. Now, when I was a kid, nobody ever talked about anoxic ocean water. Now, maybe nobody looked, but I sure never read one paper about this. It's now being discovered all over the world. All over the world, they're finding anoxic zones in the mouths of rivers. And so this suggests that if anything, we're already using too much fertilizer. Now, this doesn't mean that we couldn't use it a lot smarter. And this particular paper analyzed what they called the yield gap fraction and argued that in the developed world, they're probably using fertilizer, if anything, overusing fertilizer. But in the underdeveloped worlds, there's very inefficient use and high pollution driving from this fertilizer use. And it certainly doesn't give you the suggestion that we can dramatically increase fertilizer use and feed 2 billion more people. That doesn't seem to be in the cards that I can see. A final paper that tried to put the trends of agricultural production, land availability, and population growth together. And we'll just look at the top graph here. This is agricultural production per person. So this is another per capita graph. And look at it. It again says we peaked a couple of decades ago, that we've made no progress in the last decades in more agriculture beyond keeping up with population growth. And they project to 2030 that we'll have a 14% reduction. And so they kind of see the same thing that I'm theorizing, that if anything, we're going to have lower production per person because we have this 2 billion extra people coming along and we have this finite pizza to eat. And so along came a new limits to growth concept in 2009, and this paper came out just before the big Copenhagen summit, and so there's all sorts of fanfare to this paper on planetary boundaries by Rockstrom et al. From the Stockholm Resilience Center. And basically they were restating what the limits to growth had said 40 years earlier with some fancier language and some more specific definition of variables, but it was really the identical logic again of where are the limits to this planet, what are the metrics that we should be measuring of our ecosystem natural capital, and are any of them, do we think we're going over the edge? Or are we reaching a boundary? They suggest that the nitrogen cycle is already overloaded, and they suggested that biodiversity loss was not unsustainable also. And they have a number of metrics. If you can't read this, atmospheric aerosols, chemical pollution, of course, climate change, ocean acidification, things like that. What I found between 2009 and 2010 was policymakers started picking this up. I was reading it in political material. As an earth scientist, that told me something. We better wake up. We finally found a framing that they get, which we think all the stuff we write that they never read a word of. And so I realized as I read more and more policy and political literature picking up this planetary boundaries concept that we should think about this. Think about maybe using it more comprehensively. And so you might imagine that, gee, I happen to have this global terrestrial NPP data set. Maybe that'd be a good planetary boundary. And so, yeah, I thought, read through, talked with Rockstrom and the group a lot about that concept and realized that not only is terrestrial NPP conceptually a logical measure of planetary capacity, but it happens to be one we have a global data set for, which a number of the others, they have a great concept and no measurement. And so I suggested that terrestrial net primary production integrates at least 5 of their defined planetary boundaries, and that it itself might be the most fundamental planetary boundary of all. And this is what I argued in this little science piece. So this is what took me a page and a half to go through, is that terrestrial NPP may just be a planetary boundary. It seems also to be constant from the 30 years of record that I'd been looking at. So that suggests it really is a boundary. Not just a conceptual boundary, but a boundary that I don't think we're capable of making any bigger in any way. And so, as I said before, the minute you think like that, you start realizing now we have a global carbon pie that we have to partition out. And that when it's all gone, because we can't make it any bigger. So then we'd been working on bioenergy. So here's another vector of thinking that comes into this in the last year. And we'd been starting to use our global NPP to calculate global bioenergy capacity at this real abstract theoretical level. So we thought, okay, let's put all these pieces of the carbon pizza together. So here's that 40% of human currently appropriated. What's interesting is those earliest papers had about the same magnitude, 35 to 40%. So everybody, as they make an attack on this, keeps coming up to about the same number. So something like 40% humans are already appropriating. As we started thinking about what's left, when you say that 40% is being appropriated, it implies you have 60% left available. Well, we realized a couple of things. First, about a third of that's below ground root growth. And so other than potatoes and carrots, we're not going to be harvesting much of that. Another huge fraction, about 30%, is what we labeled unavailable. And that's a combination of national parks, wilderness areas, and places that are so remote that it'd take you more energy to get there than you could harvest, like way up in northern Siberia or someplace like that. So once you took the unavailable out, the below ground out, suddenly we find there's only about 10% left. About 5 petagrams of carbon per year of our annual plant production is all that we see that's left that conceivably could be available. Well, boy, that starts getting to be a way different thinking than thinking you have 60% left. And so here's where the bioenergy part comes in. So the economists and energy policy people write papers. This is one of their papers that suggest, here we are in 2010, that for the rest of this century, here's the trajectory of growth in global energy use. All right, EG is exajoules. And so this green wedge is what they forecast bioenergy is going to have to provide to our overall energy future for the planet. And their number here by the end of the century is 425 exajoules. Remember 425. Because what we found doing basically our pizza pie distribution of available carbon for bioenergy, instead of 400 exajoules, here's total global energy consumption right now, and we see that you could never reach more than about 50 exajoules. So instead of 400, we're talking about an order of magnitude less available bioenergy than what the energy policy people were expecting, shall we say, in their papers. And there's a number of references in here for a number of these papers, and they're all quoting bioenergy capacities for future use that we see as fundamentally impossible. And we started with a real measure of global annual plant production, and they didn't. And so this is in this month's Bioscience. October issue of Bioscience is our global bioenergy paper. And we basically say that we don't see more, that bioenergy can ever provide more than about 10% of global energy use at the maximum. And we're all for appropriately use bioenergy, but we got to quit using these vaporware numbers of 400 exajoules. This is just nuts. I mean, that'd be like the whole world growing redwoods and we clear cutting it every year is about what that boils down to. And so you really start thinking of, once you finish an analysis like this, you really go over the edge, let me tell you. So this is where I go off into things that I know nothing about, but you keep trying to search for where's the world going now. And of course, we've heard the whole definition of this epoch is the Anthropocene Era. And so we've just done this analysis of the global carbon budget, see that we only have about 10% remaining before a planetary boundary, it seems to us, of plant production. And then you go over to the human activity side of the ledger, and what's going on? Well, here's fossil fuel emissions since 1990. You know, the base year that the Kyoto Protocol, everybody's supposed to work to. Look at this. Well, and we had a good year in 2009 emissions-wise, and that was because of the global economic collapse. And but what happened in 2010, it hopped right back up. In 2011, we'll get the numbers for 2011 within a month, and there's just no chance it isn't going to be another world record of fossil fuel emissions. Now, if any of you saw Al Gore's movie and you remember he was on the stage and he got on that forklift and shot up in the air to show how high up the graph you'd go, this is the graph. This is the global air temperature anomaly expected for various scenarios of the IPCC model runs. We are on the A1FI, which is known as the fossil fuel intensive. And that is what the previous graph showed. Well, A1FI by 2100 takes us to here, to something like 5 degrees warmer as an average global temperature than we have now. We don't think the biosphere will function, shall we say, advantageously for humanity at that temperature. And yet that's the trajectory we're on right now, and we can't kid ourselves. It's just the hard numbers that we get from the emission data and from the global atmospheric CO2 data. There's no question that that's what's happening, despite our best hopes. All right, come on. I killed it. It doesn't want to go any farther. Do it next. Yeah. All right. We'll see if we can keep her going. One of the things some of my international friends put together, Will Steffen did this graph that is kind of as just a glance. You don't even need to look at the details. They call it the Great Acceleration, and it just uses tons of different metrics of human activity, and it makes the point of every one of them is just going up like this exponentially over the last 100 years. And that really is the whole point, is we have exponential growth. If you don't like graphs, you can look at it in cartoon fashion. And it's the exact same measure. We've got exponential acceleration of human activity by any of dozens of metrics you care to choose from, and we have a finite planet. And it appears from our NPP analysis that we not only have a finite planet, but we can see a planetary boundary measurably in sight as far as I'm concerned. And so this starts getting more interesting to think about. Well, what's humanity going to do here? We know that the engine of all this ultimately is our pursuit of economic growth. And this is growth of world GDP since the year I was born again, and it's gone up by an order of magnitude. About 5 trillion to 50 trillion. Do we figure in the next 50 years, is it going to go to 100 trillion? That's what the economists plan. They write papers all the time planning exactly that. And I don't think it adds up. I simply don't think the biosphere can carry $100 trillion per year global GDP. Period. And so it seems like we're on our way with our economic planning to overrunning the planet in a very fundamental way. And it doesn't appear that any of our political leaders show any insight into this or anything more than let's get the economy growing again. Aren't they saying this right today? Both of them right today. Every stump speech they give is how fast we've got to accelerate the national economy. And then they go to the G8 conference and they say it for the whole world. And you start as an Earth system scientist saying, I don't know how much longer this can go. Now, you think I'm just some individual quack that's gone off his rocker. But look at all these people that have written whole books saying the same thing. This only took me 3 minutes to compile. There's dozens of books being written by actual smart people coming to the same conclusion. I think it's pretty unprecedented. I don't remember books like this by the dozens in the past. There was always a few. Now, there's always been a few Chicken Littles. I feel like that myself nowadays, and yet I'm not alone anymore. When we try to, there's been a number of ways to try to calculate the human footprint. This Global Footprint Network just won Japan's Blue Planet Prize this year. They think we've already overshot the planetary capacity for human consumption, that we're basically eating our seed corn now, and we're going to hit the wall in some way, somehow, and who knows when. This is one of my favorites because this is our own backyard. You know, Jared Diamond lives in the Bitterroot just south of Missoula most every summer. And this book, the first 50 years are about Montana. And he's saying, here's this place that calls itself the last best place. And he says, I'm seeing a lot of fraying around the edges even here. Think of what it must be, the places that are the last worst place, if the last best place looks this tenuous. And so if you haven't read this, you ought to give it a read. And so then I veered off into wild sociology, which is completely beyond anything I have any training in at all. And you see that other people have been thinking about this for decades. I maybe have done a new calculation of some interest, but I'm by no means the first one to come to this kind of conclusion. And so there's groups, especially in the UK, that have been on this for a number of years, and they try to define things like how can we measure human success at something other than economic growth? And they identify one of our most fundamental problems is we keep using GDP as our measure of success, and which is exactly what this country does right today. Gross domestic product is what all the economists in Washington talk about. They're trying to make bigger, and yet you're seeing books. Well, this quote says it all. I don't even need to say anything more. GDP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. That is such a good one-liner. And that really is what this whole group of ecological economists, the sustainable economists, people like that, that they're trying to work out how can we come up with better metrics of human success than GDP growth, since GDP growth looks like it's going to overrun the planet sooner rather than later. And this is a good one here. It shows that, this is my friend in Canada, Americans have been more successful decoupling GDP from happiness than decoupling it from material and energy flow. And so it basically shows that when I was, gee, Rory, this is when I was your age. I was the happiest I ever was. And so now I'm richer, but I'm no happier one bit. So there you go. You've already won, and you didn't even know it. They do analyses like this on a global scale, and they look at country level. And basically, as wealth increases, happiness basically asymptotes. This really kills you at about $10,000 per year per capita. Now, you know, those of us over that, I'll bet we don't really want to go backwards, but it's a pretty persuasive point that we keep accumulating material wealth, but there's no evidence that we're getting any happier as we do it. And so there's economic groups that are going after this, things like this one, Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. This book I just read is quite good, Prosperity Without Growth, Economics for a Finite Planet. So there's this fringe of economists that are trying to think through how we can wiggle out of this before it's too late. Because, you know, otherwise, here we're back to our emission curve. There's nothing that's changed this yet. And until, you know, I basically end with this, that the climate problem is not going to be solved by us just driving Priuses and putting up solar panels. We've already, at least some of us, done that. We have to, at a fundamental level, redefine the purpose of humanity. Now, how much bigger can you get than that? And yet that's, see, I told you I'd go completely over the edge. And there I am. I'm now over the edge. The end. I don't know what we're going to do. And I can't answer questions because I don't actually know anything about any of this.
Well, some folks might have to run, but for those that can stay, let's hope this was.
There we go. Yeah, Duncan. Show me the fallacy. I hope I'm wrong. I don't get any pleasure in this at all. This conclusion. Yeah.
Yeah. You're looking at this on the board.
Yeah.
You think as hope collapses.
I think everybody under 30 should leave the room before we talk about it. You know, I feel bad for the young people. We sit around talking about the end of the world to them, and it's creepy. So now I'll answer the question. I think there's cultures that are way more self-sufficient than others. And so I think, and certainly the wealthier, the 1%ers are going to have it made because they're going to be able to just buy their way out of any problem. But I don't think I see any of them in this room. So you can imagine from a kind of a raw survival point of view that there'd be areas that could just become more self-sufficient and kind of drop to a simpler lifestyle and go on their merry way reasonably well. But the global economy is so interconnected that I don't know that it wouldn't all come down together. We almost tested this theory in 2008. The first set of disaster books I read before these were about a half dozen of the Wall Street collapse disaster books. And these are the people that know this best and say we were days away from the global banking system imploding. And having that happen would probably bring down places that otherwise might have made it, because in ways that we can't even normally think about. just the simplest sort of financial resources we work with to do our little local things, you ultimately discover are being controlled in Singapore and stuff like that. You read that all the time. And so you can imagine both, that there would be just areas that kind of cave in, like Greece might cave in, for example. Or you can imagine at the macro scale an entire economic, probably mostly driven by a banking sector collapse, which is why they reacted so fast in '08, even knowing they didn't know what they were doing, but figuring doing anything's better than nothing, which was, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, a place like India will, with their population continuing to grow, if that agricultural region, like that groundwater region, bottoms out in a pretty rapid way, which they can predict, they measure, they know when it's going to bottom out. Groundwater hydrologists can measure this stuff, but you can imagine pretty abruptly that they could be in big trouble with accelerating population. Oh, yeah.
So science still had
Yep.
last December they had a series of articles that
Are going up. Yeah, is what they claim.
Health, education,
Yeah.
alleviation of poverty,
Yep.
etc. With that, and now science published your paper. I mean, science is loving these extremes, but why aren't they bringing
Yeah,
these
okay.
alternative viewpoints
Yeah.
to move past?
Yeah, to me, this is one of the most pivotal questions in science and society right now, is we have economic theory going like this, and we have planetary boundary theory going like this. And it's a matter of when, not if. I mean, there is some limit, some point to the planetary capacity. Maybe it won't be till the year 2500, but maybe it might be 2020. And knowing the difference is getting to be kind of a big deal. And yet, I ask my economist friends, and I go over to our econ department. I'm kind of an honorary Boy Scout economist over there now. And they say this sort of steady state economics is considered kind of fringe hippie stuff in the economic discipline. And so, yeah, it's nice for them to kind of work on that, but nobody takes it seriously. Go see what the Treasury Department's doing and see what the big-time economists are thinking. And that's what that discipline seems to think of any of this kind of thinking. And you wonder if it's going to take some sort of economic collapse for them to get real. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, I didn't do the ocean. Well, if you look at marine natural fish catch, that peaked 20 years ago. Aquaculture has done well. I mean, we wouldn't all be eating salmon and prawns and what are these other things that are now cheap without it. Primary production of the ocean, if I remember right, is only about 1/10 of the land. Most of the open ocean is as sterile as a desert. And so I don't think we can expect it to save us, and it might even be in worse trouble than, I mean, we do have 53.5 petagrams to work with here, and it seems to be stable. It's not going down. So to me, you might say the good news is over 30 years, terrestrial plant production has not gone down at all. It seems to be steady. But I don't think we can look at the ocean as a big help. And we're polluting it pretty seriously, and the ocean, or in the river mouths, we've probably all heard of the big Pacific garbage patch. Yeah, well, there's some serious ocean ecology issues, so I don't think it's going to save us. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Completely sequestered them. Yeah. 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 You know, it just seems like crazy talk, and yet you look at so many of these trajectories, and it's hard to draw different conclusions. One of the things I'm most demoralized about is our complete inability to have a functional global governance of any kind. And in fact, at least half of Americans can't even imagine taking orders from the United Nations or anything on any topic. They just philosophically, nobody's going to tell us Americans what to do. Well, boy, when you talk about global cooperation, that doesn't cut it. And so I don't. No, I should for those that are under 30 here, because I just feel bad giving lectures like this. And so my pep talk. Are you under 30? Yes. Is the good news is you have to rebuild everything. I mean, when you're in college, don't you want to go out and fix everything? Well, we need you to. The faster you get everybody over, I'm not going to define an age, to just retire and quietly go off in some low carbon existence cabin and stay there, and then you just rebuild everything. That's really what we have to do. We're not going to get out of this climate issue with small fixes. And I've struggled for 3 or 4 years trying to avoid that conclusion. So it gives me no pleasure to do that. But I think that's where we're going, and the lack of leadership acknowledging this. Notice the presidential debates didn't breathe a word of any of this kind of stuff. Not one word.
Well, I think we're getting close. The really happy thought I have is
I think we need to.